Are you Pamela? The voice came from behind her, calm but certain. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. Pamela Johnson froze, her hand still on the cup of cappuccino she hadn't touched in 10 minutes. The cafe was warm and quiet, filled with the smell of roasted coffee and soft music. She turned slowly and saw him, a tall man with gentle eyes and a brown jacket, holding a book. "I'm Chris," he said. "Monica told me I might find you here." Pamela's heart skipped. She hadn't agreed to meet anyone. Her friend had set her up without warning. 3 years after losing her husband, this felt too soon, too strange. Yet something in his voice made her stay. Who was this man? And why did her heart suddenly feel alive again? Chris sat across from Pamela, the small round table between them holding 2 cups of coffee, one untouched, one nearly empty. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The hum of quiet chatter filled the silence around them. Pamela's fingers played nervously with her napkin while Chris watched her with patient curiosity. "I'm sorry if this feels sudden," he said finally. "Monica told me you liked this cafe, and I thought I'd say hello. No pressure." Pamela gave a soft laugh, more out of nervousness than amusement. "She's been trying to set me up for months. I didn't think she'd actually succeed." "She warned me you'd say that," Chris replied, smiling lightly. "I told her I'm just here for good coffee." That made her smile for real this time. It was small, but it reached her eyes, a rare thing for her lately. The conversation started simple. He talked about his work in architecture, how he loved designing buildings that balanced beauty and function. She told him she was a teacher and how her students kept her busy and sometimes sane. The tone was easy, like 2 strangers slowly finding a rhythm neither expected. Yet, beneath Pamela's calm, her heart was beating faster than it had in years. She wasn't sure if it was fear or curiosity. It felt strange to enjoy someone's company again, to feel her voice come alive in a way it hadn't since David's passing. Chris noticed her hesitation but didn't push. When she grew quiet, he filled the gaps with gentle stories about his move from Atlanta and his awkward first week in Charleston, trying to navigate narrow streets and find decent sweet tea. Pamela laughed softly. For a moment, she wasn't the widow holding her grief together. She was just a woman having coffee with a kind man. As time passed, their words grew warmer, more personal. He asked what she liked to read. She told him about her love for classic novels, especially Pride and Prejudice. He teased her gently for being a teacher cliché. She rolled her eyes, pretending to be offended. "You shouldn't make fun of a woman who could give you a quiz on that book," she said, smiling. "I'll take my chances," he replied. They laughed, and for a while, the sound of her laughter filled the little space between them like sunlight. Pamela studied him quietly as he spoke. There was no arrogance in his tone, no sense of trying too hard. His smile was easy, his eyes kind but steady. When he listened, he really listened. Still, she could feel a wall inside her, a quiet voice warning her not to get too comfortable, not to forget what loss had taught her. Chris leaned back, taking a sip of tea. "You know, you have a very peaceful way about you," he said. She blinked, surprised. "Peaceful? That's not a word people usually use for me." "Maybe not out loud," he said, "but it's there." Even when you're guarded, it feels like you've learned how to breathe through storms. Pamela looked down at her cup, unsure how to respond. No one had spoken to her like that before. Not since David. She changed the subject, asking about his favorite books, his family, anything to shift attention away from herself. But the more they talked, the more she realized he wasn't like others who tried to fix her with forced comfort. He wasn't trying to fill the silence. He was just sharing it with her. The cafe began to empty. A few customers left with takeaway cups, and the waiter wiped down nearby tables. Pamela checked the time. It had been nearly an hour. She hadn't noticed. Chris glanced at her untouched drink. "You don't like coffee?" She chuckled softly. "I do. I just forget to drink it when I'm talking." "That's a good sign," he said with a grin. Pamela hesitated before asking, "You said you moved here for work. What kind of projects do you do?" "Sustainability mostly. Designing eco-friendly buildings. I try to build things that last but don't harm what's around them." That line caught her attention. Something about the idea of creating lasting things stirred something deep in her chest. "Things that last," she repeated quietly. He nodded, not realizing how much those words meant to her. Pamela sat back, the silence returning for a few seconds. Her fingers tightened around her cup. She could feel that moment coming, the one she'd been avoiding since he sat down. There was no point in pretending. If she didn't say it now, it would hang between them anyway. She took a slow breath and said, "Chris, there's something I should tell you." He looked up, curious but calm. "Okay." "I'm not just single," she said softly. "I'm a widow. My husband, David, passed away 3 years ago." The cafe noise faded in her mind. She braced herself for the usual reaction, the awkward shift, the quick change of subject, or the sudden look of pity that made her feel small. But Chris didn't move. His expression didn't harden or soften out of sympathy. He just nodded slowly, meeting her gaze with quiet understanding. "Thank you for telling me," he said. Pamela blinked, not expecting that response. "You don't mind?" He shook his head gently. "No, I don't mind. All I see is a strong woman." The words hit her deeper than he could have known. Her eyes watered before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." "You don't have to apologize," he said, voice low and steady. "It takes courage to share something like that." She looked away, trying to compose herself, but a small, shaky smile formed on her lips. For the first time in a long time, Pamela felt seen, not as someone broken, but as someone still standing. Across the table, Chris smiled again, lifting his cup in a gentle toast. "To courage," he said. Pamela hesitated, then raised hers too. "To courage." The sound of their cups touching was soft, almost unnoticeable, but in that quiet moment, something inside her began to heal. The next time Pamela saw Chris, it wasn't planned. She had stopped by the same cafe on a Saturday morning after grocery shopping, still wearing her work-in-progress look, jeans, a gray sweater, and her hair tucked under a scarf. When she pushed the door open, there he was again, sitting near the window, reading the same architecture book. He looked up, smiled, and waved. "You again," he said warmly. Pamela laughed. "You're in my spot. Then I guess I owe you a coffee." That was how their routine began, not with a plan, but with small coincidences that soon became habits. Some days they talked for 10 minutes, others for hours. They shared simple things, stories about bad days, their favorite foods, funny moments from work. Chris was easy to talk to. He never filled the silence with empty words, and he never made her feel like she had to be anyone other than herself. Weeks passed. The air grew cooler, and Charleston streets turned gold with fallen leaves. Chris often joined Pamela on short walks after school. They'd stroll through Waterfront Park, where the sound of waves blended with laughter from tourists. Pamela liked how the breeze felt against her face again. For years she had walked fast, head down, always busy. Now, with Chris beside her, she slowed down. One afternoon, they stopped by the fountain near the pier. Children ran in circles, chasing bubbles. Chris watched them, smiling. "I forgot how carefree kids can be," he said. Pamela's lips curved into a soft smile. "Liam's like that. He can find joy in anything, even math homework sometimes." Chris chuckled. "He sounds smart. I'd like to meet him one day." Pamela froze for a second. The thought of introducing someone new into her son's life brought a rush of fear and uncertainty. But when she looked at Chris's expression, gentle, patient, without pressure, she found herself saying, "Maybe soon." That maybe turned into yes 2 weeks later. Pamela took Liam to the city's science museum on a Sunday. It was one of his favorite places. Planets, experiments, and endless buttons to press. Chris met them there, dressed casually in a simple jacket and sneakers. Liam was shy at first, holding onto his mother's hand, but Chris crouched to his level and said, "So, who's the real scientist here?" Liam grinned. "Me." "Good," Chris replied, "because I need someone to explain all this to me." The tension broke instantly. Within minutes, Liam was showing him around, explaining how magnets worked and how light could bend through glass. Pamela watched from behind, a quiet smile spreading across her face. Seeing them together felt strange, but beautiful. There was no awkwardness, no forced connection. It was natural, easy. Later, as they walked out of the museum, Liam held a small toy spaceship he'd bought with his allowance. "Mr. Chris," he said, "if you could go to space, would you?" Chris smiled down at him. "Only if you're the pilot." Liam's laughter echoed down the hallway. Pamela's chest tightened in that bittersweet way she had come to know so well. She was happy, truly happy, but guilt whispered somewhere deep inside her heart. That night, after Liam went to bed, Pamela sat alone on the couch, the quiet of the house wrapping around her. She looked at the framed photo on the wall, David in his firefighter uniform, smiling, full of life. Her fingers brushed the edge of the frame. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I don't know if it's right, but I'm trying." She could almost hear David's voice in her mind, gentle as always. "You don't have to stop living." The next morning, she met Chris for breakfast at a small diner near the school. He noticed her quiet mood right away. "You okay?" he asked. Pamela hesitated. "Sometimes I feel like I'm doing something wrong. Like I shouldn't be moving on." Chris stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "You're not replacing anyone," he said softly. "You're remembering how to live again. That's not wrong." Pamela looked at him, eyes glossy. "It feels complicated." "It's supposed to," he replied. "The best things always are." She smiled faintly. "You make it sound simple." He shook his head. "Not simple, just honest." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in thought. Through the diner window, the morning sun streamed in, soft and golden. Pamela thought of how far she'd come, from the woman who avoided crowds and conversations to the one now sitting across from a man who saw her for who she was. Over the next few weeks, they grew closer. Chris would pick her up after work sometimes, and they'd drive along the coast, listening to music and watching the water reflect the setting sun. He never pushed her to talk about David, but when she did, he listened quietly. "He used to dance with Liam in the kitchen," Pamela said one evening. "He couldn't cook to save his life, but he always tried." Chris smiled. "Sounds like someone I would have liked." She nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. "He was everything." "I'm not trying to be him," Chris said gently. "I just want to be here." Pamela looked out the window at the fading light, her heart caught between what was gone and what was growing. When Chris dropped her off that night, she lingered by the car door. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For being patient." He smiled. "Some things are worth waiting for." Pamela walked into her house, her steps slow but steady. She peeked into Liam's room. He was already asleep, clutching his toy spaceship. She stood there for a long moment, her heart full of conflicting emotions. Love, loss, guilt, and hope, all blending into something she couldn't yet name. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of the sea. Pamela looked out through the window at the night sky, where a few stars glimmered faintly. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to whisper a quiet truth. "Maybe," she said softly, "I can be happy again." The first chill of winter arrived quietly. Fog over the harbor, leaves swept into corners, mornings that smelled of damp salt and rain. Pamela began waking earlier than usual, restless. Some days she sat by the window before dawn, watching the slow light crawl over the rooftops, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside her. It had been months since she met Chris, and yet her heart still carried two lives, one that had ended, and one she was too cautious to begin. The warmth she felt around him frightened her. Each laugh, each glance, came with a pang of guilt, as if she were erasing the man who once filled her world. That guilt grew heavier the night she dreamed of David again. He was standing at the old pier, wearing that same navy jacket, calling her name. But when she reached out to touch him, he turned and walked into the fog. She woke up trembling, tears slipping down her cheeks. Later that morning, she called Chris and asked to meet by the river. Her voice was steady, but he could hear something different, a weight she couldn't hide. They met at their usual spot, where the bridge arched low and the water flowed wide and slow beneath. The sky was gray, the air thick with mist. Pamela stood by the railing, hands tucked into her coat pockets, eyes fixed on the ripples. Chris approached quietly. "You sounded off this morning." She nodded without looking at him. "I've been having dreams. About David." He waited, saying nothing. "I keep thinking, maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe I'm betraying him by moving on. He was a good man, Chris. The best. And sometimes I feel like I'm letting him down by even being here." Her voice cracked. "I don't know how to love again without feeling like I'm stealing from him." For a long moment, the only sound was the water brushing against the rocks below. Chris stepped closer but didn't reach for her. "You're not stealing anything, Pamela." She turned toward him, her face pale, eyes red. "Then why does it feel that way? Why does happiness feel like something I have to apologize for?" Chris took a slow breath. "Can I tell you something?" She nodded, barely. "When my mother passed, my dad never remarried. He said his heart was like a garden, and she was the first flower. After she was gone, he thought the soil was too broken to grow anything again. But one spring, he planted tomatoes, just to see if he still could. He said it didn't mean he forgot her. It meant he finally believed the ground could hold life again." Pamela blinked back tears, her breath catching. Chris continued softly, maybe that's what love really is. Not a replacement, but a renewal. Your heart's the same garden, Pamela. David will always be the roots. But you deserve to see something bloom again. The words hit her deeper than she expected. Her chest tightened, not with pain this time, but with release. She turned back to the river, watching the current carry fallen leaves away. I used to think if I kept grieving, it meant I still loved him, she whispered. But maybe I've just been afraid to let the world keep turning. Chris's voice was gentle. It's been turning all along. You just haven't looked up. A tear slipped down her cheek. I don't know if I'm ready. You don't have to be ready, he said. You just have to be willing. Pamela let out a trembling breath and finally looked at him. Really looked. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, only quiet understanding. The wind caught her hair, brushing strands across her face, and Chris reached out slowly, tucking them behind her ear. It was the smallest touch, but it felt like something sacred. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sky began to clear, and faint sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off the surface of the river. Pamela followed the shimmer with her eyes, her shoulders softening. I think I've been living half a life, she said quietly, always waiting for permission to feel joy again. Chris smiled faintly. Maybe it's time to give yourself that permission. She nodded, the words settling in her like a seed. When they finally walked back toward the parking lot, Pamela felt lighter, not healed, not yet, but open. As they reached the cars, Chris stopped and turned to her. You don't owe anyone guilt for surviving, Pamela. Least of all the man who loved you. She met his gaze, her throat tightening. I'm beginning to believe that. He smiled softly. Good. That night, after putting Liam to bed, she went through an old box of photos. She found one of her and David, taken years ago at the beach. Both of them laughing, faces sunlit. She didn't cry this time. Instead, she traced her fingers over the image and whispered, "Thank you." Then she slipped the photo back into the box and closed it gently. When she turned off the light and lay in bed, the silence felt different. Not empty, just peaceful. The kind of quiet that comes when something within finally exhales. Outside, the moon hung low over the river, and the sound of waves carried through the open window. Pamela closed her eyes and let it wash through her. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to live. By early spring, Charleston had turned bright again. The trees on King Street were heavy with pink blooms, and the cafes had begun setting chairs outside. Pamela walked through the city with a quiet steadiness now, still cautious, but no longer afraid of being seen smiling. People noticed. Some smiled back, some whispered. It started small, neighbors asking subtle questions, co-workers exchanging looks when Chris stopped by the bookstore to meet her after work. The town that once wrapped her in sympathy now wrapped her in curiosity. One Sunday morning after church, it all came to a head. Pamela had just stepped out of the chapel with Liam when she heard her name. Mrs. Carter, David's aunt, stood near the steps, her arms crossed, expression hard. "I've been hearing things," she said sharply, "about you and that man, the one who's not your husband." Pamela froze, her fingers tightening around Liam's hand. "Mrs. Carter, please." 3 years. Pamela. That's all it took. You think David would be proud of this? Her voice rose enough for others nearby to turn. A few lingered on the walkway, pretending not to listen. Pamela's heart thudded. She felt that old shame creeping in. the same guilt she thought she'd buried by the river weeks ago. Before she could answer, Chris appeared from the side entrance, carrying a small paper bag of pastries. He saw her face, then the crowd. Without hesitation, he walked toward them. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," he said calmly. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. "So it's true." Chris stood beside Pamela, his voice even. "If you mean that we care for each other, yes. It's true." The older woman scoffed. "You have no idea what that family's been through. David loved her with everything he had. And now she's..." Pamela's voice broke in, gentle but firm. "I still love him. That hasn't changed. But I'm still here, Mrs. Carter. I can't live in the past forever." Mrs. Carter shook her head. "You could at least honor his memory properly." Chris spoke softly, but every word carried weight. Honoring someone's memory doesn't mean locking yourself in grief. It means living in a way they'd be proud of. Pamela isn't forgetting David. She's finally remembering herself. There was a silence, long and uneasy. Mrs. Carter's face softened, if only for a moment. She looked at Pamela, eyes glistening, then turned away without another word, disappearing into the crowd. Pamela stood still, trembling slightly. Chris reached for her hand, not to rescue her, but to remind her she wasn't alone. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though tears gathered in her eyes. "I think so. For once, I didn't hide." He gave a small smile. "That's strength, Pamela. Not everyone will understand, but you don't need their permission." That night, the weight of the encounter stayed with her, not as pain, but as purpose. She sat at her desk long after Liam had gone to bed, typing something on her laptop. The idea had come to her months ago, but fear kept her from acting on it. Now, she felt ready. A few weeks later, a sign appeared outside a small community center. "Healing Hearts, a space for widows and widowers." It was Pamela's project. The first meeting was small. 5 people sitting in a circle, holding paper cups of tea. Their stories were different, but the ache in their eyes was the same. Pamela didn't try to lead. She just listened. When one woman broke down saying she couldn't stop wearing her husband's shirts, Pamela smiled softly and said, "Keep wearing them until your heart tells you it's okay to fold them away." As the weeks went by, the group grew. People began sharing laughter between tears, swapping stories of love and loss, trading recipes, planting small seeds of friendship. Pamela watched it all unfold with quiet awe. One evening, Chris dropped by after work to help set up chairs. He watched her greet the newcomers, her once timid smile now full and bright. "You've built something beautiful here," he said. Pamela looked around the room, the people talking, the soft hum of shared hope, and nodded. "I think I finally understand why I went through it all," she whispered. "It wasn't to break me. It was to help me see others who were breaking too." Chris smiled, brushing her hand lightly as he passed her a stack of papers. "You turned pain into light. That's rare." Later, when the session ended and the last guest left, Pamela stood at the window watching the sunset paint the sky gold and rose. She thought of David, his laughter, his kindness, and for the first time, she didn't feel guilt pressing on her chest. Just gratitude. She whispered softly, "I'm okay now." Outside, the city lights flickered on. Somewhere nearby, laughter echoed from a passing group. Pamela turned off the lights, closed the door of the center, and walked out into the evening, shoulders back, eyes forward, heart unafraid. The world might still be watching, still whispering, but she was no longer living for their approval. She was living for herself. By the time the cold lifted, Charleston had transformed. The streets that once lay quiet beneath winter rain were now alive with sunlight and color. Pamela noticed the change not just in the city, but within herself. The heaviness that used to wake with her every morning no longer ruled her days. It was still there, softly, quietly, but now it shared space with something new: peace. Her mornings had rhythm again. She'd wake to the sound of birds outside her window, make breakfast with Liam, and walk him to school. The world felt ordinary, and that ordinariness was a gift she'd once believed she'd never have again. Chris remained a steady presence through it all. He didn't push, didn't rush. He simply showed up, in laughter, in quiet dinners, in thoughtful texts that said things like, "I'm proud of you today." When she was tired, he listened. When she was joyful, he joined her. His consistency felt like sunlight after a long storm, something she could lean into without fear of it fading. Their connection deepened in small ways. A shared glance when Liam told a funny story. The ease of silence between them. The comfort of knowing that even without words, they understood each other. One afternoon, Chris joined Pamela and Liam for a science fair at Liam's school. Liam's project, a homemade volcano, stood proudly on a table surrounded by bright posters and messy glue marks. Chris crouched beside the display, genuinely impressed. "You built this all by yourself?" "With Mom's help," Liam said proudly. "She mixed the vinegar." Pamela laughed, and nearly caused an explosion in the kitchen. Chris grinned. "Sounds like teamwork to me." Liam smiled wide. Something about the way Chris spoke to him, not as a child but as an equal, made him light up. As the fair went on, Pamela watched them laugh together, and something stirred quietly inside her. Not fear this time, not guilt, just gratitude. That evening, as they walked home, the sunset stretched across the sky in shades of orange and gold. Liam ran ahead with his backpack bouncing behind him. Pamela walked beside Chris, their shoulders brushing every so often. "You're good with him," she said softly. Chris glanced at her. "He's a good kid. Smart. Curious. Reminds me of myself at his age, except he's probably a lot cooler." Pamela smiled. "He's been through a lot. He missed having someone to talk about. Well, everything. He used to ask me if heaven had phones." Chris's expression softened. "That's a beautiful kind of hope." They stopped at a street corner, waiting for the light to change. Pamela looked at him, really looked. His kindness was never loud or showy. It lived in the quiet moments, the steady gestures that said, "I'm here." "Sometimes I wonder what David would think," she said gently. Chris met her gaze. "I think he'd be proud. Not because of me, but because you're living again." The light turned green, and they crossed. Weeks turned into months, and spring deepened. Pamela began writing again, not for work, but for herself. Essays, reflections, letters she never sent. She wrote about grief and laughter, loss and new beginnings. Chris would often find her at the café, lost in thought over her laptop, a half-empty cup beside her. One afternoon, he joined her with his own book in hand. She looked up and smiled. "Do you ever feel like life is giving you a second draft?" He thought for a moment. Maybe it's not a second draft. Maybe it's the same story, just with a new chapter. Pamela leaned back, letting that thought sink in. "A new chapter," she repeated quietly. "I like that." As spring stretched toward summer, the air grew warmer, and so did their closeness. They went for walks along the waterfront, sometimes with Liam, sometimes just the two of them. They shared meals, jokes, and quiet moments that didn't need defining. But beneath Pamela's calm, a fragile hope began to form, one she was afraid to name aloud. One evening, as they sat by the river where she had once broken down months ago, Chris reached for her hand. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Pamela hesitated. "I do. But I'm scared to." He nodded, not pressing her. "That's okay. You don't have to have it all figured out. Just keep walking forward." She looked at him, then at the soft glow of the sunset reflecting off the water. The last of her old fears loosened their grip. She didn't know what the future held, but she was no longer running from it. That night, after she tucked Liam into bed, she sat by her window and watched the stars appear one by one. Somewhere deep inside, she realized she wasn't just healing anymore. She was ready. Ready for what? She didn't fully know, only that it had everything to do with a man who had walked with her through both silence and laughter, through memories and new beginnings. And as spring unfolded in full bloom, Pamela finally allowed herself to imagine something she hadn't dared to before, a shared tomorrow. The morning began like any other, except for the secret Chris carried in his pocket. Pamela didn't notice at first. She was too busy packing snacks for Liam, who, bouncing around, asking questions about their mystery, was outing. Chris had only told them, "Dress comfortably. It's a surprise." The drive took them beyond Charleston's busy streets into the quiet countryside, where the air smelled of rain and blooming flowers. Pamela leaned her head against the car window, watching fields glide past, curious but content. She hadn't seen Chris this calm yet focused before. His eyes held that quiet determination she'd grown to love. "Are you ever going to tell us where we're going?" she asked playfully. He smiled, eyes on the road. "You'll see soon. Trust me." When they arrived, Pamela's breath caught. Before them stretched acres of vibrant color, roses, lilies, magnolias, and azaleas in full bloom. It was the Charleston Botanical Garden, alive with spring. Butterflies fluttered across walking paths, and sunlight glimmered on the pond's surface. Liam's excitement filled the air. "This is amazing! Can we go see the fish, Mom?" Pamela laughed. "Go ahead, sweetheart. Stay where I can see you." Chris waited until Liam ran ahead, then turned to her. "I remember you once said you loved flowers but never got the chance to visit here." She blinked in surprise. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything that makes you smile," he said softly. They walked slowly along a stone path lined with tulips. The colors surrounded them, red, gold, pink, like life itself was celebrating. Every step felt like a quiet renewal, and Pamela couldn't help but think how far she had come since the day they first met in that little café. As they reached a small wooden gazebo overlooking the pond, Chris stopped. He looked around, the gentle sway of branches, the reflection of the sky on the water, and then at her. "This place feels right," he said. Pamela tilted her head. "Right for what?" "For this." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Pamela's breath caught instantly. Time seemed to slow, the distant sounds of children and birds fading until there was only the two of them. "Chris," she whispered. He smiled, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Pamela, when I first met you, I saw someone carrying more strength than she knew. You were sitting in that cafe, lost in thought, but there was something in your eyes, something unbroken, even in all the pain. I didn't come into your life to take away what you had. I came because I wanted to walk beside you in whatever came next." Her eyes glistened as he opened the box. Inside was a simple, elegant ring, a gold band set with a deep blue sapphire, surrounded by small diamonds. "I'm not here to replace David," he continued softly. "He'll always be part of who you are. What I'm asking is if you'll let me be part of the rest of your story. I don't want to rewrite your past, Pamela. I just want to share your tomorrow." Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She covered her mouth, overwhelmed by the purity of his words. "Chris," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you have no idea how long it took me to feel like I could even dream again. For so long, I thought that moving forward meant letting go of everything I loved. But you've shown me that love doesn't end, it grows." He reached for her hand. "So what do you say? Will you keep growing with me?" Pamela's chest tightened. She thought of David, his laughter, his bravery, the way he used to hold her when storms rolled through. A memory surfaced of one late night years ago, before his last shift. They had been lying in bed, talking about life and the future. "If anything ever happens to me," he had said with a gentle smile, "promise me you'll keep living. Promise me you'll find joy again." She had laughed then, brushed off his words. She never imagined she'd have to keep that promise. But now, standing in this garden surrounded by life and color, she finally understood what he meant. She looked at Chris, her voice shaking but sure. "Yes, yes, I will." His face broke into a smile, relieved, emotional, filled with quiet happiness. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and for a moment, they both just stood there, holding each other in silence as the world around them continued to bloom. From a distance, Liam spotted them and ran toward the gazebo, his small voice echoing, "Mom, did he just propose?" Pamela laughed through her tears. "He did." Liam threw his arms around both of them. "Does that mean we're all going to be a family?" Chris crouched down, looking him in the eyes. "If you'll have me, buddy." Liam grinned wide. "Only if I get to be the best man." They all laughed, and in that laughter was something sacred. Joy that didn't erase the past, but honored it by choosing to keep going. As the sun dipped lower, they walked through the garden together, hand in hand. Pamela glanced at her ring, its sapphire catching the light. For her, it wasn't just a symbol of love, it was a promise kept. David had once asked her to keep living. Today, she had finally said yes to that too. The world around her seemed brighter, not because everything was perfect, but because she had learned that love could begin again. Different, but still true. Chris squeezed her hand as they left the garden. "You okay?" Pamela smiled through tears. "More than okay." She looked back once more at the flowers swaying in the wind, their colors bold and alive. They reminded her that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about blooming again, even after the longest winter. The following weeks passed like pages in a book Pamela never wanted to end. The news of the engagement spread quickly, first among close friends, then through the small Charleston community that had watched her grieve for so long. At first, she dreaded the whispers, the looks that used to sting like salt in an open wound. But this time, something had shifted inside her. She wasn't hiding anymore. The celebration took place in their backyard, a modest but cozy space surrounded by fairy lights and potted flowers that Liam insisted on arranging himself. The evening air carried a faint scent of jasmine, and soft music played from a small speaker. Monica was the first to arrive, bringing her trademark energy and a homemade strawberry cake. "I told you this day would come," she exclaimed, wrapping Pamela in a hug. "You just needed someone who saw you again." Pamela laughed, the sound light and unburdened. "You also told me to give dating apps a chance, remember?" Monica waved her hand. Details. Details. Clearly, my way worked better. Liam dashed around the yard, proudly showing off the decorations. Look, I made this sign, he said, pointing to a hand-painted board that read "Love grows here." The letters were uneven, some smeared with fingerprints, but to Pamela it was perfect. Chris knelt beside him, adjusting a lantern. "You've outdone yourself, buddy." Liam's grin widened. "Mom says I'm the creative one." Pamela watched them from the porch, her heart full. For so long, she had believed joy like this wasn't meant for her again, that she'd used up all her chances. But life, it seemed, had other plans. As the night deepened, laughter filled the air. Neighbors who once looked at her with quiet pity now clinked glasses in genuine happiness. Even David's sister, Margaret, came, hesitant but smiling. "I wasn't sure I should," she admitted softly when she found Pamela by the punch bowl. Pamela took her hand. "You being here means more than you know." Margaret's eyes shimmered. "David would have wanted this for you. For Liam." She paused, her voice trembling. "He always said you were his greatest adventure. I think he'd be glad you found someone who sees you the same way." Pamela swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. When the crowd began to thin, she and Chris stood together beneath the fairy lights, watching Liam chase fireflies across the lawn. "Remember when we met?" Chris asked, his tone half playful, half nostalgic. "You could barely stand to be in a crowded room." She smiled. "And you kept sitting with me anyway. I wasn't going to let you disappear," he said simply. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "You didn't." For the first time in years, Pamela wasn't haunted by the word after. After David, after loss, after sorrow. Now there was she could love David and Chris, grieve and laugh, remember and move forward. That night, after Liam had gone to bed, Pamela sat at her old writing desk, the one she hadn't touched since before the accident. Dust had gathered across its surface, but the familiar creak of the chair and the feel of paper beneath her fingers stirred something inside her. She opened a fresh notebook and wrote 3 words at the top of the page: "The art of beginning again." For a moment, she stared at the title. It scared her, the honesty of it. But she had learned that healing wasn't neat or graceful. It was messy, sacred work. Her pen moved slowly at first, then with growing confidence. There are moments in life when everything you know ends, and yet the world keeps turning. You breathe, not because you want to, but because your heart refuses to stop. And then one day, you wake up and realize you're still here, and that means there's more story to tell. Tears blurred her vision, but she kept writing. She wrote about David's laughter, about hospital waiting rooms, about the nights she didn't think she'd survive. She wrote about Chris's patience, Liam's light, and the quiet courage it took to smile again. Hours passed unnoticed until Chris appeared at the doorway, holding 2 mugs of tea. "Can't sleep?" She shook her head, smiling softly. "No. I think I finally found my words again." He placed a mug beside her and looked at the page. "You're writing." "For the first time in years," she said. "It feels good. Like coming home." Chris pulled up a chair beside her, watching her with pride. "You know, there are people who need to hear what you've been through. You could help them." Pamela nodded slowly. Maybe that's the point of all this. Not just to survive, but to share. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windows. She listened to it, smiling faintly. Rain had once reminded her of the night she lost everything. Now, it felt like a lullaby, a reminder that even storms could nurture growth. Weeks later, Pamela's short essays began circulating online through a grief support group she had joined months before. Messages started pouring in, strangers thanking her for putting into words what they couldn't. One message stood out. It read, "I lost my husband 2 years ago. Your story gave me hope that love doesn't die. It just changes shape. Thank you." Pamela read it aloud to Chris one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Liam chase the sunset on his bike. "She gets it," Pamela said quietly. Chris smiled. "So do you." She turned toward him, the fading light brushing her face. "I think I finally do." As twilight deepened, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. The ache of loss was still there. Perhaps it always would be, but it no longer defined her. Pamela had learned that moving on wasn't betrayal. It was bravery. And in the soft glow of that evening, surrounded by laughter, love, and the echo of all she had survived, she whispered a silent thank you to David, to Chris, to the universe that had given her the strength to begin again. She looked up at the stars and smiled, because she was no longer surviving. She was living. The sun was just beginning to rise when Pamela opened the window of her study. The world outside glowed in soft gold, the kind of light that whispered of beginnings. She stood there quietly for a moment, listening to the birds, the faint hum of morning traffic, and the heartbeat of a life that finally felt her own. Years had passed since that day in the café, the day Chris first said her name like it mattered. The seasons had come and gone, and with each one, Pamela had grown more certain that healing wasn't a finish line. It was a rhythm, a way of living. Her book, The Art of Beginning Again, now sat on shelves across the country. Readers from every corner of the world had written to her. Widows, parents, friends, all connected by the shared ache of loss and the fragile hope of renewal. Pamela often read their letters aloud to Liam, who was now taller than her and just as thoughtful as his father had been. One evening, as they packed boxes for a book signing trip, Liam paused to look at an old photo of David. He was standing on the pier, holding a 5-year-old Liam on his shoulders, both grinning into the wind. "Do you still miss him?" Liam asked softly. Pamela smiled, her hand brushing over the frame. "Every day. But it's not the kind of missing that hurts anymore. It's the kind that reminds me of where I've been and how far I've come." He nodded, thoughtful. "I think he'd like Chris." She chuckled. "He does. I feel it." That night, after Liam had gone to bed, Pamela sat by the window with her journal. The house was quiet except for the soft rustle of wind through the curtains. She began to write, not for publication this time, but for herself. "Grief taught me that love doesn't vanish when someone leaves. It changes form. It moves from presence to memory, from voice to silence, from touch to heartbeat. It becomes the air that carries you forward. Love doesn't erase love, it expands it." She set down her pen, exhaling deeply. Those words had lived inside her for years. Now they finally felt ready to be spoken aloud. Chris walked in, barefoot, holding 2 cups of tea. "You're awake again," he said softly. Pamela smiled. "I was just writing. About love. Still chasing words," he teased gently. "Always." She took the cup, their fingers brushing. "I was thinking about how lucky we are. Not because everything turned out perfectly, but because we found peace after the storm." He leaned against the window beside her. "You made peace. You built it, piece by piece." Pamela looked out into the moonlit garden, the same one they'd planted together the year they got engaged. Tulips and daffodils swayed gently in the breeze, blooming with the same fierce persistence that had defined her journey. "I used to think happiness was something that happened to people," she said. "Now I know it's something you allow." Chris reached for her hand. "And you finally did." The next morning, the family drove to the community center where Pamela now volunteered every weekend. What began as a small grief support group had blossomed into a thriving program of workshops, counseling, and creative healing. The walls were covered in handwritten notes, each one a message of survival, love, or gratitude. One note, written by a woman named Clara, caught Pamela's eye. "You helped me see that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without pain." She smiled softly, pinning a new message beside it. "You are allowed to be happy again." As the morning session began, Pamela stood before a circle of faces, some tearful, some quietly hopeful. She told her story not as a tale of loss, but as a testament to endurance. "There's a moment in grief," she said, "when you think your story has ended. But it hasn't. It's just changing chapters. And sometimes, the pages that come after the pain are the ones that teach you who you really are." A woman in the back wiped her eyes. "How do you know when it's okay to love again?" Pamela smiled gently. "When the thought of joy no longer feels like betrayal. When remembering brings warmth instead of ache. That's when you'll know your heart is ready." After the session, she stepped outside into the sunlight. Chris was waiting by the car with Liam, both waving. The simple sight filled her with quiet pride. Later that evening, they had dinner on the porch. Laughter filled the air. Stories, inside jokes, the kind of easy comfort that comes from family. Pamela watched the two of them, her two worlds somehow woven together without conflict or comparison. When the dishes were cleared and the sky turned indigo, she felt a familiar tug inside her. The need to speak one last truth, not to anyone in particular, but to everyone who had ever stood where she once stood. Broken, uncertain, afraid to hope again. She took a deep breath and began recording a message for her online audience, the community that had grown around her stories. Her voice was calm, steady, full of warmth. "Life has a way of breaking us open," she began. "Sometimes in ways we never imagined. But inside those cracks, light finds room to enter. It teaches us that endings aren't just endings, they're beginnings waiting to be understood." She paused, looking toward Chris and Liam, who were laughing over a deck of cards. "I've learned that love doesn't compete with what came before it," she continued. "It builds upon it. It doesn't replace love. It expands it. When you open your heart again, you're not letting go of the person you lost. You're carrying them forward in a new way." Her eyes softened. If you're watching this, and you're still in the middle of your storm, please know this. You are not alone. You are allowed to cry, to rest, to remember. But you are also allowed to laugh again, to build again, to love again. The recording ended with a quiet smile. The screen faded to a montage of moments: Liam's graduation photo, Chris teaching him how to change a tire, Pamela signing books for readers, the support group laughing together over coffee. Each image was a chapter of renewal, proof that life could bloom again even after devastation. Her voice returned for the final narration, soft and steady over gentle piano music. Maybe strength isn't about holding on or letting go. Maybe it's about learning when to do both. I once believed my story ended with loss. But it didn't. It began there. Because every goodbye carries within it the seed of a new hello. And if you're brave enough to keep living, one day you'll see what I finally did. Love is endless, and hope never truly dies. The video faded to black. Then the final text appeared on screen. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to help us keep telling stories of hope and second chances. Tell us in the comments, do you believe strength comes from moving forward or holding on? Your words might inspire someone who needs to hear this today. Pamela closed her laptop with a satisfied sigh, the reflection of the screen fading from her eyes. Outside, the night hummed softly. Somewhere, a wind chime sang. Chris wrapped his arms around her shoulders. "You did it again," he murmured. She tilted her head against him. "No," she said with a smile. "We did." He kissed her temple. "How does it feel?" Pamela looked out at the stars. Like coming full circle. Like living twice. The camera lingered on her face for a moment. Serene, strong, luminous in the dim light, before fading completely to black. Her voice, one last time, whispered through the quiet. "Love doesn't erase love. It expands it."